Thank you for tuning into KBRA podcasts. We cover topical research discussions, industry commentary, and more. As we continue to expand globally, KBRA Podcast is a go-to source for timely briefings directly from our knowledgeable team members. In KBRA's inaugural Spotlight Series episode, Hesser, Chief Strategist at KBRA, is joined by Daly, Head of Public Finance and Financial Guarantors, Harvey Zachem, Managing Director, and Peter Scherer, Associate, to discuss the American consumer, retail sales activity, and observations about KBRA's sales tax rated portfolio. COVID-19 has certainly left its mark economically, but highly effective vaccines give real hope to a return to normal in 2021. As always, KBRA will continue to monitor its portfolio on a case-by-case basis. Stay tuned to learn more.
Thanks everyone for listening in to a KBRA podcast. My name is Hesser. I'm the Chief Strategist for KBRA. And today I'm going to set the stage for our topic by talking about the U.S. consumer in the age of COVID. So I think it's safe to say that we've all learned how a pandemic-driven economic downturn can differ from a more traditional one. In a pandemic, policymakers are challenged to preserve as much of the economy as possible until a cure can be found. There are no excesses or imbalances that have to correct, and there is no one to blame. That clarity paved the way for massive bipartisan fiscal and monetary relief, which has given rise to a whole host of economic markers and trends that we don't see in a more typical downturn. For instance, personal income has gone up, housing and stock market values have gone up, and that in turn has driven retail sales higher, while still leaving more than a little left for personal savings, which has also gone up. Now, one takeaway is that massive fiscal relief is, at best, a blunt instrument. It probably wasn't policymakers' intent to have 2/3 of unemployed workers making more when adding in stimulus checks than when they were employed, but that's what's happened. Another is that $3+ trillion of relief is a lot of money, enough to offset the effects of the downturn in terms of a lot of things, including retail sales. Now, we also know that Americans like to spend money. It's what we do. We will spend until at least one of the following two things happen. One, when our personal sense of well-being is threatened, such as when job security diminishes or when savings dwindle. Or two, when we simply can't spend to the degree we'd like, as has been the case in a pandemic when lockdowns and restrictions have been imposed. In the COVID era, Americans have encountered both obstacles, but over the course of much of the year, we proved to be remarkably adept at adapting. The jobs market recovered faster than expected as higher earning professionals made a surprisingly nimble transition to working from home, while those employed in the manufacturing sector found a robust environment as the reopening required inventories to be replenished. Meanwhile, temporarily laid off lower income services workers were benefiting from stimulus checks. All of this was surprisingly constructive for retail sales in the aggregate. Now, as we entered September, cracks in the story began to form. An unexpectedly powerful third wave of viral outbreak took root, triggering new restrictions. Stimulus checks had run out, and talks of another round stalled amidst political bickering. And the jobs market had softened as the outbreak pushed out further recovery in travel, hospitality, and leisure sectors, while large employers increased layoffs of higher earners. This can be seen in the consumer sentiment trends, which have flattened out, and in the high-frequency data, which began to roll over. It could also be seen in retail sales, where growth has been decelerating since the summer. All of a sudden, prospects for a double-dip contraction have begun to build. Then November 9th happened. Pfizer and BioNTech's highly effective vaccine announcement, followed by Moderna's, AstraZeneca's, and Johnson & Johnson. This makes a return to normal a very real possibility in 2021. But in the meantime, we are looking at what one well-respected public health authority deemed a horrible next 3 months. So the cross currents here are powerful. Over the near term, the holiday season, which looked like it could be a strong one a couple of months ago, is now looking like a more normal one, at least in terms of growth, with National Retail Federation's core group, excluding autos, gas stations, and notably restaurants, midpoint calling for a 4.4% growth over last year. The last year holiday sales contracted, by the way, was 2008 when we were in the thick of the GFC. Now, as we look ahead, the cross currents of vaccine optimism versus outbreak pessimism is skewing towards the pessimistic side over the near term, with Q1 real GDP contraction a growing possibility, although consensus still calls for 3.1% growth. Looking across the valley, to use the preferred descriptor of the moment, the clouds figure to lift in Q2 and we could be off to the races in the second half. Remember our keys to American spending. The threat to our personal well-being will clearly go down if the vaccine proves to be effective, as does the possibility of lockdowns and restrictions. Eventually, we settle back into the reality of sub 2% growth post getting back to trend line towards the end of 2021. Now, we expect unemployment will likely be above the Fed's forecast of 5.5% by the end of 2021. So I've talked broadly about the resilience of retail sales and the U.S. consumer. Let me turn it over to my colleague, Peter Scherer, to walk you through some of the puts and takes beneath the headline number. Peter?
Thanks, Van. Retail sales were hit hard in the early months of the pandemic and bottomed out down by a stunning 20% year over year in April. In aggregate, however, retail sales were down year over year in just 3 months, March, April, and May, and they've outperformed in 2019 in each subsequent month. Emerging cracks in the employment picture notwithstanding, retail sales were up nearly 6% year over year in both September and October, marking the 2 strongest months year to date. The recovery in retail spending, however, has been very uneven. Online retailers have been a clear winner here, with e-commerce sales up by a remarkable 29% year over year in October. Home improvement, sporting goods and hobbies, and new car sales were also each up more than 10% year over year as pandemic-related shifts in consumer behavior persist. Many other retail categories, however, continue to experience pronounced weakness. Bars and restaurants bottomed out down 52% year over year in April and remained down 14% as of October. The onset of cold winter weather in many cities will crimp outdoor dining options, which will weigh on the sector in the months ahead, and it appears inevitable at this point that many bars and restaurants will not have the resources to outlast the pandemic or reopen once it has passed. Brick-and-mortar clothing retailers also continue to struggle, with sales recovering from an 85% year-over-year decline in April to a 13% reduction by October. Lastly, filling stations, which bottomed out down 39% in April, remained down 14% as of October, evidencing our continued reduced mobility in the current environment. It remains to be seen what the ever-important holiday sales season will mean for retailers, but we expect that forces confronting retailers this year will impact the retail landscape for years to come. Karen Daly will pick things up from here with a few words on the implications of all this on municipal credit. Karen?
Thank you, Peter. The lack of real-time data for a number of public finance sectors is a problem for credit analysts. Retail sales is a case in point. While the national retail sales data Peter just discussed is reported on a timelier basis relative to local retail sales, we do not assume that national and local measures will necessarily track one another. For example, many local jurisdictions tax food purchases at a lower rate or not at all. Why does this problem exist to begin with? Sales tax administration varies across jurisdictions, with businesses that collect sales taxes typically forwarding collections to states, which in turn distribute revenue allocations to local governments. This process takes time, meaning that it may take several months before we have clarity on the behavior of sales tax performance throughout the pandemic. Parenthetically, it is also a major headache for issuers performing forecasts of their revenues. What KBRA decided to do is examine the amount of breathing room our rated sales tax credits have when thinking about just how much pressure they can withstand while the country works its way out of the pandemic and its economic knock-on effect. I'd like to turn to Harvey to discuss our portfolio of rated credit. Harvey, can you tell us how we test the strength of our sales tax portfolio?
Thank you, Karen. In our rating process, we consider stress scenarios under which annual debt service requirements are assumed to increase up to the additional bonds test limitation, which is usually 2 times. Since we are generally reviewing gross revenue pledges, coverage is well in excess of leverage restrictions, as the sales tax is an important operating source for these entities. Therefore, even if fully leveraged, pledged revenues would have to fall at least 50% on an annual basis for coverage to be imperiled. Although there have been some severe monthly reductions in certain localities since the onset of the pandemic, no monthly reductions have approached this level of decline. Our expectation is that entities like transit authorities will not overly rely on sales taxes to support debt issuance, since sales tax revenues are needed for day-to-day operations, and local fare box recovery is in many cases a less crucial operating component. In addition, system-generated revenues have been pressured by constrained economic environment that results from stay-at-home orders and other COVID-related restrictions.
Thank you, Harvey. How would you characterize the strength of KBRA's rated sales tax portfolio?
Our rated portfolio is very strong. All of our sales tax credits encompass major cities and in many cases draw on resource bases that include the surrounding metropolitan area. Sales tax generators are diverse, as would be expected, reflecting economic activity in a large population center with notable absence of concentration. Retail sales revenues for KBRA-rated credits have rebounded from year-over-year reductions recorded at the outset of the pandemic, although we recognize vulnerabilities remain going forward.
Thank you, Harvey. In our October 14th article on retail sales, what did we find out about certain areas of the country that are experiencing unusual declines in sales tax?
We found that the most significant declines were in areas that imposed more stringent stay-at-home orders, and that's as would be intuitively expected. We also found it difficult to make state-to-state comparisons since there are differing collection lags between when the sales tax transaction occurs and when sales tax revenues are received by the municipality. In some cases, there is as much as a 3-month lag, which makes it difficult to make a timely assessment of the degree of recovery, or in areas of resurgent virus, the dampening effect on retail activity. Moreover, once vaccine availability becomes widespread, it will take some time for the impact to reach the local retail sector and local retail revenues.
We have several takeaways for our audience. The first is that COVID has certainly left its mark economically, but sooner than expected, highly effective vaccines give real hope to a return to normal in 2021. Secondly, problems in the timeliness of disclosure have long presented a challenge to credit analysts. And lastly, KBRA sales tax revenue bonds are well secured and coverage remains strong. Recovery of individual issuers' pledged sales tax revenues may not be as strong as national trends due to localized retail issues. We will monitor each issue on a credit-by-credit basis. If you want to review our research, it's free of charge on kbra.com. Thanks for listening in.
This concludes our episode. Feel free to continue the conversation on LinkedIn and Twitter @QuirlBondRating. We would also like to remind you that our research and rating reports are free at KBRA.com. If you have any podcast ideas or would like to share your feedback with us, please email media@kbra.com. We hope to see you next time.